I suppose the way to get started is to first make a promise. I promise you. We're going to go over today the ways to approach God, or the ways that we can show the existence of God. And the promise is that if you learn these ways, if you at least kind of know them a little bit when you go to college, I promise you that if you stick to them, you'll have a foundation so that by the time you're a senior in college, you'll be smarter than when you were a freshman in college. Because what happens to a lot of people when they go to college is, at least when I was where I taught, it seems like a lot of people entered as freshmen and they were really smart, and then when they were seniors, they were not so smart. And so one question is, why does that happen? But I think one reason is that people don't have a good foundation in metaphysics. Because if you have a good foundation in metaphysics, you actually have a basis from which to learn more things. Part of it, I think the other part of the promise and the other aspect of it is continuing to improve living an upright moral life. But we'll just stick with the metaphysics for this class. So if you get a chance, if ever you're interested, you can go to YouTube and you can type in Bertrand Russell versus Copleston on God or something like that. Bertrand Russell was a famous British philosopher in the 1950s. Frederick Copleston was another famous British philosopher. And in the 1950s, they had a debate on the BBC, not on YouTube, about the existence of God. And I think if there's an image to think about as far as when we're starting out on this little journey, is that when I got to New York City after coming back from Rome, I went to the Museum of Natural History or something to that effect, and there's the obligatory room where they have the display of the science of evolution. And so if you go into that little room, you look at all sorts of interesting things, animal bones, pictures of bacteria, supposedly, before and after, before they don't have eyes, after they do have eyes. There's something interesting about that, but not the topic of this class. But eventually you get to one slide, and it says there's atoms. And that's it, right? And so, of course, if you're thinking about this a little bit, you got to ask the question at some point, well, where did those atoms come from? Right? If we're going to kind of go back, you get to these atoms, and you got to say to yourself at some point, where do these atoms come from? Because they can't come from nothing. They can't create themselves, and they can't come from nothing. So then the question is, well, where do they come from? Now, in this little debate, so that's just an image. I want to put that aside, but I want to say in this little debate that took place between Russell and Copleston, for me, it's an interesting debate because when I was teaching philosophy at the university, a lot of times in your introduction to philosophy courses, at some point, in many courses, you ask the question, how can you prove God's existence? And where I taught, a lot of my colleagues, they would do what Bertrand Russell did. And to this day, this still happens. They would say, well, there's really only one proof of God's existence that we're going to concern ourselves with. It's called the Ontological Proof. And the Ontological Proof, it goes something like this. Well, actually, you can kind of summarize it in like 2 sentences. Think of the greatest thing you could think of. Right? And God is greater than that thing. Or God is the greatest thing of all those things which could be thought. That's another way of putting it. God is the greatest being of all those beings that could be thought. Now, during this particular debate between Russell and Copleston, Russell tries to say to Copleston, I think this is your argument for God's existence, and I don't accept it. And Copleston says, well, no, that's not my argument for God's existence at all. That argument, it's valid from a logical standpoint, but it's actually a weak argument. It's not that strong of an argument. And the reason it's not that strong is that it really just depends on how your mind works. There's no necessary relationship between how your mind works and what's actually out there, what actually exists, what we observe. All right, so Copleston shifts the debate. And Copleston will, in this particular debate, if you ever listen to it, Copleston basically says, well, the argument he uses is the argument of cause and effect, or contingency versus necessity, right? He says, you look around and you see none of us are necessary beings. It's possible that any of us might not be here, right? We don't exist of necessity. We don't exist from the beginning of time. And also, when you look at, if you kind of study history, there's all sorts of things you could point to where you could say, well, yeah, it's possible I would have never existed. Right? There's all sorts of... And so Copleston says, well, look, you can't go back to infinity saying every being is contingent. At some point, you're going to have to say there's a necessary being. When they get to this point of the argument, Russell says, I think we should talk about something else. Right? Which is a classic diversionary tactic. So when we speak of the proofs of God's existence, we're trying to speak of, I guess from this example, we want to say two things. Number one, we're not just talking about thoughts that can be going through our mind. Right? We're trying to go from what we can observe about reality to something that we can say ultimately about God. So are there any questions on that? So let's look at the first proof. And now this proof here is taken from Aquinas' Summa Theologica. You can go to the Summa, you can find it online. The proofs take up about 4 typewritten pages. It's not that long. But what my friend here has done is this is what he gives to his intro to philosophy classes. And he's just taken like the essential logical points from each one of the proofs, which from what I understand, you know very well the terminology. Sometimes my colleagues would say, well, we're not going to teach Aquinas' proofs. We're just going to teach the ontological proof, because students aren't sophisticated anymore to understand the philosophy that you need to understand in order to understand these proofs. And I would say, come on, it's not that hard. It's, you can, and even if you don't fully understand it, you can come to understand it, but you can more or less understand the logic that's involved. And as an indication of that, another little story here is there's another thing you can find on the internet of I think he's dead now. A British, his last name was Dawkins, Christopher Dawkins. So he was being interviewed by a host on the BBC about God and science and all this kind of stuff. And at one point, it's a typical thing where he's like introducing himself and everything that he believes. And then at one point they open up the radio program for questions from the audience. So this fellow calls in from the Highlands of Scotland. Now, if you understand the dynamics of the British Isles, So the radio program would be the BBC in London. That's high British culture. And the Scottish Highlanders, I guess that would be like someone from maybe Arkansas calling into a Boston radio program. Something like that, you know. Kind of not the most sophisticated people in the world. So anyway, so this fellow calls in from the Scottish Highland, and he goes into a little monologue about, you know, his own personal life, his story, and whatnot. And they're very patient with him. But then at some point he says, "Now, Mr. Dawkins, let me ask you a question. Is there something or is there nothing?" Right? So there's kind of a pause. And Dawkins says, "Well, of course, there's something." And then the Highlander says, "Well, that's something. Does it come from something or does it come from nothing?" And then there's another pause. He says, "Well, it comes from something." And then the guy says, "Well, then tell me now. How can it be that if you keep going back like this, eventually you're going to have to say there's nothing, right? Or are you going to say that there's something that the something came from, right? Because something can't come from nothing." And then there's a long pause, right? And then at that point, Dawkins does, which when you go to college you'll find, if you're ever with professors, there's two things they do. They'll never admit that they're wrong. Or I should say, to be more accurate, few professors will admit that they're wrong, or that they don't know, right? Usually what they'll do, if you ask them a question and they really don't know the answer, the first thing they'll do is they'll try to somehow make fun of the questioner. Right? They'll point out some foible, or they'll say, "You didn't ask that question properly," or something along those lines. The second thing they'll do is they'll tell you to read their books. And that's what Dawkins did in this case. So after kind of the long pause, he says, "You know something? I've written 8 books, and you should read one of them." Right, so that's the sign that the Scottish Highlander got him. But this is, I think, just this little way of thinking, which, if you're ever in a position where you got to talk about this, just this little way of thinking. There's either something or there's nothing, right? If we can see that there's something out there, we can start to think back in a chain of reasoning. And at some point, you got to say, well, there's got to be a beginning. And at the beginning, it's absurd to say that there's nothing and then there's something. There has to be a something that brings that something into existence, right? And I think that's a good way to start into the proofs. So if you look at the first proof, now the first proof deals with motion. But it doesn't deal with motion like just the way that's moving, necessarily, right? The way the pen's moving here, right? It's dealing with motion more in the sense of act and potency. So you know what potency is? What is potency? Yes?
An object's ability to change.
And then what is act?
Is it change itself?
Well,
not just.
that's moving in the right direction. Yes.
The potential for change an object has.
That you could see, yeah, in a way, yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, what the object can become. Okay? So when we speak of motion, we're speaking of motion in that sense. Right? Going from potency to act. So our senses prove that there are things that are in motion. If you look out there, if you look at the world, you can see that there are seeds, and if you observe the seeds over time, you can see that the seeds become plants, and that the plants grow, they develop leaves, they develop fruit, right? They go from potency to act. They become the fullness of what they can be. Things move, so motion here is when potential motion becomes actual motion. Now, at the same time, only an actual motion can convert a potential motion into an actual motion. The seed somehow, we know, well, not somehow, it does. It has within it the capacity to become the oak tree. The oak tree is what the seed is growing into being. Nothing can be at once in both actuality and potentiality in the same respect. This proof, or this point of the argument, refers to a principle of logic. Which one?
Come on, girls. Something cannot both be and not be.
Yes.
No contradiction. Principle of no contradiction.
Can you state it?
Something cannot be,
Cannot both be.
cannot be and not be in the same way, in the same respect.
Very good. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yes, yes. Right? So nothing can move itself. Therefore, each thing in motion is moved by something else. This sequence cannot go on ad infinitum. So we must arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Now, the second argument has to do with causality. And so before we get into causality now, what are the four causes? Just, you got to understand that to understand this argument. What are the four causes? Yes.
Efficient, formal, final, and exemplary.
This one.
Material.
Material, very good. And then what is the efficient cause? Yes.
Like the person or thing that makes it happen. Right?
That's not the technical definition, but that's the right idea, yes. Yeah, that's right? It's the agent that initiates the change. Right? That's the efficient cause. So, in the second way, we perceive a series of efficient causes of things in the world. This is the argument that Coppelson, this is one of the ways that Coppelson will use in his little debate with Russell. Right? Yeah, by the way, this is Bertrand Russell. So, when you look out in the world, you see efficient causes. Right? You see things that don't have to exist, but somehow there was some other agent or a group of agents, and somehow the action of these other agents bring this thing into existence. Okay, that's an observable fact. Which reminds me, right? We also, just to say it, there's nothing about these proofs that's from the Bible. Right? These proofs don't exist in the Bible. Well, actually, you could say there might be one or two places in the Bible where there are arguments similar to these proofs, but these proofs are not the origin of these proofs is not the Bible. Right? The origin of these proofs is Aristotle in the 300s BC. The first proof, the unmoved mover, is an argument that Aquinas basically just, if I can use the word, plagiarizes from Aristotle. But he doesn't plagiarize because he admits it comes from Aristotle. Right? So there are proofs that anybody that just wants to think about things and their intellect is using well, they should be able to figure this out. Okay, so we perceive in the world a series of efficient causes. We also know that nothing exists prior to its existence. You didn't exist before you existed. There's a moment where you were created. Right? You don't exist. Nothing exists prior to when it exists. Nothing exists prior to when it's made. That's what the Highlander was trying to. That's the point that Dawkins wouldn't accept from the Scottish Highlander. How can you say that something exists and is nothing at the same time? So nothing in the world of things we perceive is the efficient cause of itself. Nothing can cause itself to come into existence. Sometimes when these fellows who are trying to argue against the existence of God, sometimes when they're pushed like to their foundation, like their first moments, like this one fellow, his last name is Dennett. He's actually the only one that's actually trained as a philosopher, right? But when he's pushed to like say, okay, well, where does the universe come from? He'll say, the universe created itself. That's a logical absurdity. It's an impossibility. Nothing creates itself. Yes. Oh, no, you're sorry. If a previous efficient cause does not exist, neither does the thing that results, the effect. Therefore, if the first thing in a series does not exist, nothing in the series exists. If the series of efficient causes extends ad infinitum into the past, then there would be no things now. This is false. There are things now. And there are things now that came into existence through efficient causes that didn't exist earlier. So it's necessary to admit a first efficient cause that puts everything else in, all other causality into place, and that's God. Now another guy, this guy's in California. His last name is Fesser. He says, let's use just to kind of give us an example. He wants to give us an image just to help us to think about this second proof. And again, what's an image? An image is a product of what part of the mind? The imagination. Very good. Very good. The image comes from the imagination, right? Images are useful because they can help kind of point us to the truth of things, right? They can help point us to the truth. But ultimately, images at some point, they kind of fall aside, and we can just use our intellect to think about things. That's the beauty of the intellect. Images are helpful, but not the only thing, right? So he says, well, this image that we're going to use is say, imagine a train. Right? Imagine a caboose. What's the caboose connected to? A boxcar. And what's that connected to? Another boxcar. And another, and another, and another, right? So on. Till finally, you get to the engine. You get to the first car of the train. And so in this case, right, the engine is like the first efficient cause. Without the first efficient cause, the train doesn't move. So if you go back to that first image we were using about the New York Science Museum, they're saying, okay, it's at the beginning we have these little atoms, but you need a first efficient cause for these atoms to exist. So are there any questions on what we've done so far, the first two proofs? Good. So then I want to go to the fourth proof before we go to I want to do 4 and 5 before we go to 3. Now, just as another little aside, I have a friend who went to Iran, and he was there to speak on certain aspects of moral philosophy, unrelated to this stuff. But he's a Catholic guy. It didn't really come out so much in his talk, but so in his talk, he at the end of his talk, it's open for questions, like always in these kind of talks. So he was talking to 16-year-old boys at a high school. And I think something else to understand about Iranian culture is that in Iranian culture, the teacher, the classroom experience is very much one of challenge. Right? So the goal, if you're a student, is to try to kind of, at some point, stand up and challenge your teacher and beat him in an argument. And if you can do that, then you become a teacher, right? It's very much that way. So I suppose one other thing I should mention about Iran is that they don't have a strong tradition in Iran of classical philosophy. Classical philosophy meaning the philosophy that goes back to, let's say, Aristotle, Plato, using, like, you can observe the world and you can make explanations of the world using your intellect in a kind of scientific and orderly way. They don't have that tradition so much. So because of that, a lot of times when they're taught philosophy, actually they're literally taught the philosophy of Bertrand Russell. A kind of very limited notion of philosophy. And so a lot of them, even though a lot of them are actually, like, from a philosophical standpoint, they're very skeptical as like 14, 15, 16-year-olds. So that being the preface, my friend gets to the end of his lecture. His lecture was on, like, the moral life, ethics, things like this. And he gave his lecture, and then at the end of his lecture, one of the boys stands up and kind of points at him and says, "Can you prove the existence of God?" And my friend, he kind of thought about it. And he basically said this, almost the same thing as the Scottish Highlander. He said, yes, there's either something or there's nothing. If there's something, that something had to come from something else. And that something had to come from something else. Eventually you get to a point where you got to say that there's a something that comes from something that wasn't created. Otherwise you're going to end up in logical absurdities. So that's something that's not created, that creates every other thing, that's God. Now, these boys had never heard that, right, in their education. And at this point, the sign that they felt that the teacher had won the challenge is that all the boys at the same time went, ooh. Right? So the next argument here is the one on gradation of being. What is being? What is being? Don't raise your hand. I'm not. I'm laughing with you. I understand. What is being?
How about that which?
Very good, very good. That which exists. Are you a being?
Yes.
Yes. Is this pen a being?
Yes.
Yes. Do you have the same being as this pen?
No.
You have a greater gradation of being than this pen. Okay? So if you can get that little concept, you can get this proof. All right? Now, I'm going to rely, again, this proof is not new for Aquinas. He's drawing back on a tradition of reason. And you can go to Plato and find it there, though you can also find it in Aristotle. But basically, this is the way, I think once you understand this little like ladder, some people call it the ladder of being or the chain of being, it makes the proof make a lot of sense. So first of all, let's just say you start out with rocks, or things like rocks, right? The one aspect of the being of a rock or a pen or this table, right, or anything that's like just material, is that it preserves itself in existence. It continues to exist. It doesn't do much more than that by itself, right? So then, in other words, there's a way you can tell the different grades of beings. And you can tell it by comparing and contrasting the various things that you see out there. Right? So the next thing that you see are plants. Plants are like rocks in that they can preserve themselves in being. They don't just disappear. They don't just like flash and disappear. Right? They're not like, when I got back to this country, one of my roommates, what movie did he like? He liked this scary movie. He made me watch it. Of these things that just flash and disappear. Oh, what was it? It's in a house. There's a family in a house. And there are these things from the further that flash and disappear.
I don't watch horror.
I know that. It's like aliens, kind of.
No, well, they're not aliens in the end.
Not aliens, but like shadows, black shadows.
Yeah. And then I saw the movie. It's like the first horror movie I've seen in my life. But then I texted my sister and I said, "Have you seen this movie?" She said, "Oh yeah, like 3 times." But that's not, nothing really exists like that, right? Nothing just flashes and then disappears. Plants don't do that. Rocks don't do that. They preserve themselves in existence, right, over time. Like it's an important feature of being. But plants have a little bit more being, we say, than rocks. Why? Because they have more. We can observe them doing more things. They have more functions. They grow. They suck nutrients from the soil. Right? They grow. They develop seeds. The seeds kind of can blow off the flowers, fall into the soil, and new plants can grow up. Right? So there's things that plants do that rocks do not do. Right? But they do share this one thing with rocks. They preserve themselves in existence. Then you look at animals, right? And animals, they're like rocks and plants. They preserve themselves in existence. They're like plants. They grow, they mature, they absorb nutrients, and then they absorb nutrients. But then they have things that plants don't have, right? They have offspring, they make nests, or they make some sort of a habitation where they can live. They can move much greater. They have local motion. They can move this way and that way, right? There's all sorts of things that plants can do. So they have this higher element of being. Then, of course, we have humans. Again, they preserve themselves in existence. They grow. They absorb nutrients, unless they have bad stomachs, right? They, like animals, they have offspring. They also have homes, but then, unlike animals, they do a lot of things that animals don't do. They decorate their homes, right? Animals don't decorate their homes. Humans also have capacities that animals do not have. The capacity for speech. Right? Every major experiment in the last 100 years to try to prove that animals speak. At the time that it started, everybody said, they're going to do it. They're going to prove animals can speak. The best they've ever been able to do, they've admitted, was a big failure. The best they could do is like get a monkey to imitate 123 sign languages. Signs of a sign language. But they realized after the experiment it was all just action and response. It was all just that when you move the monkey to a different room, the monkey couldn't identify the thing that it was signaling in the other room. Right? Why? Because monkeys can't produce concepts in their heads. Right? They can't produce concepts and then associate a word with that concept. Only a human can do that. So we have speech, we have rationality, There's other things that humans have that animals lack. We decorate our homes, right? Then, Plato pointed out, so the highest thing in the human is actually something that's immaterial. Right? Plato pointed out, look, we see material things with our eyes. Right? Well, but really interesting. Like we can study mathematics. We can study things like circles and squares. And we see how like there can be circles and squares that exist in things. But we also know, right, to really know the properties of a circle, does the perfect circle ever actually exist in something? No. Right? And so that's an indication that our intellects, they can see immaterial things. They can see things that don't exist in matter and know them and know that they're true. Right? And so if with our eyes we can see something and know that it is, and if we see that we have this capacity to know things that are true, independent of matter, then there must be something in us that is independent of matter, that exists, that's part of us. It's like an organ. It's like the eye that sees the truth. That's the intellect. Or Plato will eventually say that's our soul. That's the soul is the animating principle of the person. Right? So one of the things then that Aquinas notices is that he says, look, you know there's a gradation of being. And you know that sometimes there can be lower beings that seem to share something that the higher being has, or at least in a kind of basic way. So, for example, there are some plants that eat, and their eating imitates the action of the animal, like the Venus flytrap. Very good, right? Or sometimes plant animals. The greatest thing in humans is speech, right? That distinguishes us from the animals. But sometimes there are animals that give the appearance of human speech. The jackal, the parrot, right? There's all sorts of jokes that can come from this. The dolphin, the monkey, right? They can start to perhaps show elements of human speech. So if the highest thing in us is the immaterial intellect, this is what gives us greater being, you could say, than the animals. Then Plato says, well, there must be some immaterial being that has no matter, that's just immaterial. It's just intellect and will. But it's also created, because all these things we know are created. Right? So he says there must be some immaterial being that's created and immaterial. What do we call that?
Angels.
Yeah, angels, right. Plato didn't call it that, but that's what we call it. Right? And then, of course, there must be then a being that is immaterial, and the reason how it's different from these secondary beings is that it's not created, as opposed to created. So if you look now at the argument, I think the argument makes a lot of sense now. There's a gradation of being. Some things are more than others. I think more and less might be better translations than better or worse in this case. Predications of degree require reference to the uttermost case. The maximum in any genus is the cause of everything in that genus. There must be some being which, because of its being, goodness, and perfection, is the cause of the being, good, and perfection of all other beings, and that's God. Now the last argument, the fifth argument, is the argument... Was there a question?
Is this over now?
I think we have 5 minutes.
I think we have 5 minutes, yeah. So the last argument is the argument that you'll hear a lot of times. Scientists will make it, like in the newspapers or on YouTube or whatever, on the internet. You'll also hear it, it's the argument of design. So for example, there's an astrophysicist at Harvard. Karin Odberg is her name. She comes from Scandinavia. And she's giving a talk on Thursday night at Harvard on astrophysics and the origin of the universe and God, something like that. And her answer is yes. Yes, there's astrophysics. Yes, there's the beginning of the universe. And yes, it comes from God. Right? And that's like there's a typical scientist that will say, look, if you look at the origin of the universe, or if you look at the beauty of creation, or if you look at how things happen in life, that's a sign that there has to be some being that has in mind an intelligence that orders these things. Another example I can think of on this one is, so at one time, I remember in the news as a kid, watching the news, and there being a story about reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone Park. And everybody was nervous at the time, that the wolves are going to kill us all. I mean, that was kind of the basic headline. We're all going to die. Wolves are returning to Yellowstone, we're all going to die. And then just a few years ago, on YouTube, I saw this 5-minute video. It was done by reporters from Russia, of all places, now that I think about it. And they basically asked the question, 15 years ago, the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone Park. What happened since then? Okay? And the video is really interesting because the first footage that they show is of a kind of desolate plain with a winding river, kind of like meandering, winding river on the plain. And there's no real vegetation, there's no trees, there's no bushes, flowers, nothing. It's just kind of like a desolate valley plain. And then they say the wolves show up, right? The first year that the wolves show up, what do? They start chasing the deer on the plain. And the deer that are too slow or whatever, they have them for dinner. And the rest of the deer run up into the hills, right? And so what happens when the deer run up into the hills, all of a sudden shrubs can start growing on this plain again, and little trees can start growing on this plain again. And then what happens when the shrubs and the trees start to growing is that animals can return to the plain, because these animals can get cover in the bushes from the eagles and hawks, whatever's flying above that want to eat them. Also, the more bushes that grow on the plain, because the deer aren't eating the bushes anymore, the more bushes that grow on the plain, it starts to control the banks of the river. And then also when the banks of the river are controlled, and then trees can grow, beavers show up at some point. They start chopping down the trees to make dams. Those dams help further control the river so it doesn't flood the plain anymore. And then the video starts going very rapid at this point. But then all sorts of animals start to return. All sorts of bees return. Flowers start to grow again. And then by the end of the video, what you see is this plain has now turned into like a beautiful flowing river through it with bushes and trees and flowers and bees and birds and hummingbirds, and the whole ecosystem has been restored. And that's an example of what Aquinas is talking about in the fifth way. The wolves, the natural bodies work towards some goal, and they don't do so by chance. But those natural things also lack knowledge. So they must be directed by some intelligence. The intelligence that directs all these natural things is God. When the wolf enters into the plain, the wolf is not thinking, I'm going to restore the ecosystem here. Right? This is not a Disney cartoon. Right? The wolf is just thinking, I'm going to eat the deer. And I'm going to get the deer that can't run fast, that can't run up to the hills. Right? So, there's no being in that whole ecosystem that's thinking of anything other than the instincts that's leading it. Right? And yet there's an incredible order that comes out of all of their action together. There must be an intelligence behind that order. That's what we call God.